Welcome to Nightmares and Grief, a place to explore and celebrate the darkness. I'm Derrick Heisey, and tonight we begin something different, a serialized journey into the deepest shadows of human consciousness. Every Thursday, I'll be reading my noir novel, To Make the World Obey. A story that asks what happens when the thin membrane between civilization and savagery finally tears. We'll follow Detective Deborah Samson as she hunts a killer whose mind fractures with each act of violence, while a man calling himself Temujin builds a tribe devoted to rejecting every box that civilization demands we live within. This is not a gentle darkness. To Make the World Obey contains graphic violence, sexual content, psychological manipulation, murder, and deeply disturbing explorations of trauma and dissociation. It examines the psychology of killers and victims alike, the way violence transforms both the inflicted and the witness. If you are sensitive to intense psychological content, brutal crime scenes, or explorations of madness, this series may not be for you. But if you're ready to examine the spaces where sanity ends and something darker begins, if you want to understand the psychology behind the headlines that make us lock our doors at night, then you're in the right place. So settle in, check under the bed, and pour a drink for the skeletons in your closet. It's time to start. July 27th, 2018. Before he became Temujin, he managed a sporting goods store. He was clean and efficient, well-respected and secure. He came in early and left late, kept meticulous files, and stayed on top of his inventory. Before he was Temujin, he was a master of tedious minutiae. He would spend hours in the back room, surrounded by boxes of cleats and tennis rackets, footballs, baseballs, hockey pads, and compression shirts with bulls or inspirational quotes on them. Among the boxes, he hunched over a calculator and receipts, plugging numbers into the little machine to send off to his superior, who would take the aggregate numbers of all the stores and send it to his superior, who would do the same and send it to his. Temujin, before he was Temujin, hadn't realized it yet, but he lived in an inglorious mausoleum. The boxes were graves, and the numbers were epitaphs. The day he became Temujin, he left the store late and locked up. He was all alone. There was no one waiting for him at home, so he did what he always did after work. He walked to the gym next door. Giant fans whirred loudly, mounted in the corners of the large, darkly colored room. The teenager behind the counter merely nodded at him as he signed in. The gym was nearly empty. There was one person, a young man running on a treadmill off in the corner. He was thin and lean, and his shirt was covered in sweat. He looked like he was talking to himself softly. Temujin went to the free weights and put his headphones on. He listened to a lecture on the peoples of the steppe. He had been unable to afford college, and he harbored the bitterness like a scar. He had a deep love of history, and when young, he carried fantasies of archaeology, ancient civilizations, and dead languages. He grabbed the 50-pound set and lifted. Genghis Khan's father was a great man who had his glory stolen, and when the boy was born, he came out of the womb and into the world with nothing except, as the legend goes, a fist-sized blood clot clutched in his hand. He murdered his brother when he was very young, and went on to unite the Mongols and conquer almost the entire known world. Temujin, before he was Temujin, put down the weights and went to a treadmill. He listened and ran. He ran faster and faster, and as he did, he felt something come together in his heart, could feel the fibers of an idea inching closer to each other and binding. He felt the birth of a new man inside his soul. He thought about boxes. He thought about all the boxes in the world. There were boxes in the storeroom of his work, boxes in the storefront, but in truth, the whole store was a box. When he left the gym, he would get into his car, park nearby, and drive to his home. Another box, filled with boxes of clothes, boxes of food, electronic boxes projecting reality placed neatly into a little ideological box for everyone to open and enjoy. Children went to boxes and opened boxes with words in them and were told about the world through boxed curriculum purchased from wealthy people who bought huge boxes to put all their things inside. The children went to bigger boxes and learned a little more about the world so that they could go out into it, equipped with a rigid, square mindset so that they could repeat the whole process. The entire history of settled civilization was boxes. Temujin, before he was Temujin, ran and went nowhere. The Mongols were a force to be reckoned with, even into the 19th century. They stayed in no single place and rode horses from infancy. When they wanted something, they went to a settlement and they took it. They were bound neither by land nor possessions. The Mongolians had seen the lie of settled civilization and rejected it. Their men were the closest thing to the natural state that the human animal was meant to encompass. Perhaps they were exactly what mankind was meant to be. Now, thanks to settling, the world breaks men down with the hammers of society and shapes them like tools. Men are stripped of their natural instincts, shaped into artificial creatures and shoved into boxes. Behave, they are told, or you will be placed into a smaller box. Temujin stopped running. He saw the world spread before his feet, saw the promise of freedom if only he would step out of his box. The entire world, not just the steppe, is a wide place, an open place. Man, the animal, was not meant to be boxed. Temujin stepped off the treadmill and went back to the weights in front of the long mirror. He grabbed a barbell. The clerk tried to stop him as he jammed the long metal rod into the curved handles of the door, and then the clerk screamed when Temujin turned on him. A change had come over the man who was now Temujin. He could feel it beneath his skin, and the clerk must have seen it in his face. The meek creature who had so faithfully calculated sums and stalked the world was dead. Temujin had killed him and been baptized in blood. When he left the gym, he emptied his bank account. All 20 years of saving for a vacation, for retirement, for death, for nothing. The keypad on the ATM was sticky with bloody fingerprints, and Temujin didn't care. That night, he packed his car with only the things he needed and drove north. In Utah, he bought a gun, and when he ran out of money, he took whatever he needed. Never again would he allow himself to be subjugated to a box. Deborah, December 5th, 2024. The body had been mutilated and dismembered. That much was evident from what she could see. Deborah waited until the flash of the crime photographer's camera stopped illuminating the blood, black now, dried into a hard crust, that covered the contents of the dumpster like paint from a dropped can. She might have been deferring to polite professionalism. waiting for the pictures to be taken before beginning her investigation, but in truth, Deborah was preparing herself. She could look, and she was good at looking, but it was always difficult. There were fortresses in her mind that needed to be strengthened with cannons and warriors, moats filled with crocodiles, and drawbridges pulled all the way up. Even before she had become a detective, Deborah had learned that parts of the mind needed to be well defended if one was to live so casually around death and not become it. The photographer took a few more pictures, and the bright flare of his camera flash frightened away the darkness for seconds at a time. Turning to Deborah, he nodded and stepped aside. "Go ahead, Detective Samson." As she approached, Deborah thought about the bursts of light from the camera and decided that some things weren't supposed to have light shone on them. The woman had been in her early 20s. Her hair had been shaved off. Until Deborah did more digging, that was all she could make out. Only the head was completely visible, tucked away in the back corner of the dumpster. The head was upside down, and the messy, jagged cut that went right along the neck, in line with the jaw, had faded to the same asphalt black as the blood that coated all the trash bags and junk. In the opposite corner, the woman's hands stuck out of the refuse like a poster for a zombie movie. It had no fingernails. Deborah made a note of it and went up to the stepladder to peer inside the dumpster. She flicked on her flashlight and illuminated those things that should remain in the dark. The eyes had been removed, too. Black, empty ports stared blankly at nothing. Deborah picked up the head with gentle hands and passed it back to the medical examiner. Going through the trash was slow. She inspected whatever little knickknacks were around each item she removed before taking it out, making mental note of anything that looked remotely useful. Deborah was certain none of it would lead anywhere, and if any of it really was relevant, it would be hard to tell. Lots of things ended up in dumpsters. A quarter of the way through the side where the head had been, she found the woman's torso. It had been cut open from bottom to top and the organs had been removed. Deborah hoped she had found them. She didn't want to go through all the trash bags looking for the woman's guts. "I need some help," she called over her shoulder. Freddie bore a deliberately pensive look on his face, staring in the opposite direction. Deborah could tell he was pretending not to hear her. "Freddie!" she barked. He snapped his head toward her and raised his eyebrows. Deborah jerked her head toward the dumpster. "I need your help. This torso looks heavy." Even in the bland light of the street lamps and through his deep tan, Freddie's face turned a little green. The toothpick sticking out of the side of his mouth wiggled around as he tongued it, and he inhaled deeply to prepare for a big sigh. Freddie had to build fortresses too. He wasn't as good at it as Deborah, though. He let too much get through. He clambered over the pile of broken bricks and half-busted cinder blocks beside the dumpster and peered inside, grimacing. Freddie mumbled a few things under his breath and then said louder, "People get worse all the time." Deborah didn't feel the need to respond. She flip-flopped on the subject herself. Reaching down, she took hold of the butchered torso and looked up at Freddie, whose grimace deepened before he reached down. None of the dead girl's flesh had started to decompose yet. It was turning out to be a very cold winter. That was good. Deborah wondered why the killer left the body in the dumpster, where it was almost sure to be found, rather than burying it or throwing it into the river. Maybe he thought she was trash. Looking at the dried blood on the dumpster, Deborah thought about how the world was full of things she did not understand. In any case, she had been raised not to shirk the tiny gifts the universe sometimes provides. She asked, "You think he brought her in a bag?" She and Freddie stood over the torso. Deborah crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes at the hollow trunk. Freddie, as before, made it a point not to look. "I think so," he replied. "There was too much blood. It must have pooled in the back." "You think he took it with him?" Freddie raised his eyes to her. She studied the body still, but she could feel his gaze. These were good moments. The kind that, at least to Deborah, validated the gruesomeness of the job. She and Freddie had worked together long enough that they developed in a minor way the telepathy of ants. She could sense when the gears in his head moved in synchronicity with hers. It was a good connection, the kind of comfortable melding of the brains that comes from long exposure or shared trauma. Deborah and Freddie had both. If we can find the bag, we can probably lift some prints at least. Deborah turned and met his eyes. At least, if we're lucky. They both turned to the dumpster. It started to snow. Tiny flakes reflected well in the fluorescent light of the alley, burning bright like will-o'-the-wisp. The photographer snapped pictures of the body parts individually as they came out of the dumpster, and once they accumulated all of the pieces, he took a picture of the assembled body. They had 6 pieces: the legs, the arms, the torso, and the head. It was like looking at a marionette with the strings cut. The killer had done a hack job of disassembling the woman. The cuts were jagged and crude. The torso included the neck up to where it connected to the jaw, and it lay open and hollow, the belly opened with flops of flesh like pale shutters. While Freddie still sorted through the dumpster, cursing quietly that he would never again wear nice shoes, Deborah walked around the body to inspect it from every angle. She walked with her hands deep in the pockets of her long coat and chin pressed into her chest. The way the woman had been cut, ragged, ugly, and brutal, implied elevated state. Agitation? No, he didn't hate the woman. Excitement, like a little kid the day of his birthday after being ready for it for weeks, counting the days. The killer was messy because he was inexperienced and too excited to control himself. "I found something," Freddie shouted in alarm. He gagged and retched, then added, "Come here and look, it's gross." He turned his head away from a large black trash bag, holding it out to Deborah at arm's length. It was gross. Deborah peered inside and immediately turned her face away, squeezing her eyes shut. She hadn't prepared herself for the wet mess weighing the bottom of the bag down. She forced her eyes to open and look at Freddie. "Is that what I think it is?" "Yeah, I'm pretty sure they're her organs." The door to Deborah's apartment creaked with the long, low drone of a wounded cat. She entered the apartment, darkened completely except for the shifting blue light cast by TV reporters on the television. The high-pitched thunk of her keys on the short table beside the entrance caused a body to stir in the living room. Small and fragile and old. Deborah's father shifted on the reclining armchair that faced the door. He reached for the shotgun propped up beside the chair, but brought his hand back once his daughter stepped into the flat light of the television. She shrugged off her coat and hung it on the stand, then went to her father and kissed his forehead. "Hey, Pop." Adam Samson groaned low in his throat. "Good evening, Debbie. I know that tone of voice." Deborah opened the refrigerator and a trapezoid of light illuminated the old linoleum floor. She emerged from behind the door and sealed away the yellow light with the soft sucking sound of the closing door. "How's Shaylee?" she asked. She held a box of Chinese takeout and got a fork, bringing them to the couch of the living room. She speared the cold noodles and pushed them into her mouth. "The girl's all right. She misses you." Deborah stabbed at a piece of orange chicken. Her eyes cast down to the food. Adam gestured his head with a slow motion to the television. "Is that why you're so upset tonight?" It was a repeat of the 7 o'clock news. The reporter, with her best smile, teeth all perfect and white, her long red hair framing her neat, symmetrical face, simultaneously alluring and professional, stood outside the alleyway where Deborah and Freddie had found the body. The woman. Deborah had to consciously amend the way she thought of it. She and Freddie had found the woman there. She chewed a piece of chicken. It was sour. She put the takeout box on the coffee table, her appetite having vanished. Her father closed his eyes and groaned again. The wrinkles around his eyes softened. I ain't heard a lot about it since that reporter lady don't seem to know a whole lot, though she won't stop talking. It's bad, though. I can tell it's bad. Deborah ran her fingers through her hair to pull it out of her face. It's bad, Pop. She hadn't looked at Adam since she returned from the kitchen. Adam gazed at her sidelong, and the desire to ask more was so loud that Deborah could hear the question he wanted to ask. But he chose not to ask. He understood when bad was too bad. Instead, he passed his hand over his smooth scalp and pressed the corners of his mouth inward. Shaylee passed her science test, he said. She did damn good, too. Only got one question wrong. You should have seen the girl's face when she came home, lit up like a big Christmas tree. I don't think I've seen the girl so happy since her birthday. She asleep? She's supposed to be, but she's probably in there reading. The voice of the reporter spoke over distant footage of the coroner zipping up a body bag. The shot was taken from outside the police line, and the yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, cutting the screen in half. Deborah didn't listen, but she heard brutally murdered and possible serial killer. Those kinds of phrases always seemed to reach her. The fortresses blew the war horns and her mental warriors manned the battlements. It happened more often at home now. Once, so long ago now it seemed, she could open the door and the dying cat squeal of her threshold would signal ceasefire from the mental war. Now, the darkness followed her inside too often. Adam pushed off the armchair with a short grunt and put a hand on his daughter's shoulder. Go to bed now, girl. You need to sleep. Rest up and get home early tomorrow. He went with stiff movements to the bedroom. Get home so Shaylee can see you. He hadn't said it because Adam Samson was an expert at deploying subtext. Deborah had understood, though. He was both worried and disappointed with his daughter. She'd never heard him talk to Shaylee's mother like that, but then he had long resigned himself to the belief that Susanna was gone before she died. Deborah understood the weight of expectation slung around the necks of golden children. She turned off the television and drank a glass of water. Then she poured a whiskey in the same glass, downed it quickly, and went to bed. Chapter 2. Deborah, December 6th, 2024. They spent the next day asking street people and sex workers if they'd seen anything unusual the night before. Neither of them were hopeful. The homeless made their living running petty scams and hawking stolen goods, and the sex workers were a perpetual source of easy head cracking whenever a cop got frustrated and needed to step on somebody. They weren't forthcoming. Freddie fell into Deborah's Oldsmobile and the worn leather seat sighed in time with him. Deborah closed her door a little harder than she meant to. Night had fallen, and the closing of the cosmic eye beckoned her own to follow suit. She shook her travel mug, but nothing sloshed. One dead end after another. They'd have to call it a day. Regroup, re-strategize, and try again tomorrow. Freddie rubbed his eyes with the heels of his palms and let his hands drop. The way these people talk, you'd think they didn't have eyes or ears. I didn't hear nothing, Deborah quoted, dropping her voice to a low growl. And I sure as hell didn't see nothing either. That last one's accurate. Triple negative. Deborah leaned her head back against her headrest and closed her eyes. The lab mostly turned up partial prints, but the full prints they had racked up no matches. She let a little groan escape her throat. She opened her eyes and put the keys in the ignition. An ancient man in raggedy clothes had been watching them from the other side of the street since they made their way to the Olds. His cheeks were sunken and his skin was dark and leathery from being exposed to the elements for too long. His white eyebrows twitched like caterpillars, and he looked left and right, and then he abandoned his shopping cart full of bags and sundries to cross the street. He leaned down so his face was level with Deborah, and once she made eye contact with him, he knocked on the window. She cranked the lever to open it a polite amount. "You the cops?" the man asked. His lips curled up like a baboon's when he spoke, revealing gums spotted with the black, protozoan-shaped stains of cancer. Deborah shifted in the seat to face him, and Freddie dropped his gaze to the glove box. Deborah nodded. "Can we help you, sir?" "You looking for a sketchy guy, huh? Some sketchy guy going around dumpsters, yeah?" The snowy caterpillars above the old man's eyes writhed ceaselessly. "Are people talking?" I'll talk, but what you got for Papa? Papa doesn't like to talk a lot, so you gotta grease his gums, you know?" The old man opened his mouth for a huge smile. Beside her, Freddie grumbled, "There's enough grease on your gums already, Pops." If the old man heard, he didn't make any indication. Deborah didn't have the same problems with bribery that Freddie had. She'd had to do it a lot when they were on the other side, and it was there that she learned that a good rat was one that was well fed. It irritated Freddie because he was one of the last Americans who retained a sense of civic duty. Deborah was more realistic. People couldn't be expected to do something for nothing, even help each other, and especially not when they lived off the fat of their knowledge. She cocked an eyebrow and hardened her expression. "What were you thinking?" she asked. The old man stood straight once again and looked down both directions of the street. He was nervous. He must have something good. "Cheddar," he said at last, returning his eyes to Deborah. "Papa's hungry." As if to emphasize the point, the old man smacked his gums with a gross sucking sound. Deborah didn't break the old man's gaze. "Freddie," she said, "pay the man." Freddie didn't look at her, but he thumbed his nose in irritation. "Come on, Freddie. Why do I have to do it? I'll pay you back. I don't carry cash." He sighed, shifted, and got out his wallet. He sniffed indignantly, took out a 20, and passed it over. Deborah took it and held it up. The old man looked like Tantalus standing in his pool in Hades. His eyes grew so large he might have actually been salivating. He reached his hand up to the crack in the window, but Deborah tutted and jerked the bill away. Shaking her head, her expression still blank, she asked, "What have you got for me?" "A big man. Big guy, arms like big cannons. He was new. I never seen him before or here before. Dark hair and big arms." The old man flexed. "Okay, the guy was big. What else?" Stroking his chin, the old man added, A big beard too. Big like a Viking. He was looking for a young girl, youngest he could find. Young and thin. Said he was looking for something nasty with a girl who could act." "Was the girl we found in the dumpster the one he picked?" The old man nodded vigorously. Yeah, that was her." "One more question," Deborah said as she scratched the 20 with her thumbnail. "Answer it, and this is all yours." Sure, whatever, baby. What do you want to know?" "Who's the pimp she worked for?" The old man's face split into a huge black grin, and he stuck his tongue out against the gum between the few remaining teeth he had. "That one's easy, baby. Lucinda fucked for peaches." Deborah was satisfied. She folded the $20 bill with a single hand and stuck it through the opening in the window. The old man snatched it away from her with a tiny squeal, then turned on his heel and returned to his shopping cart with a happy spring in his step. Freddie swiveled his head to leer at Deborah. "You wasted my 20 on a joke about fruit?" Deborah started the car and put it into drive. "We got a name, and it wasn't a joke. And I said I'd pay you back."
Chapter 3. Vicky. December 6th, 2024.
Vicky shifted the slinky back and forth in her hands, focusing her attention on the weight as it slunk from one to the other. This was her process. Some people used drinking birds, other people used fidget spinners. When Vicky was stuck, she used a slinky. Sometimes it worked. Other times, like tonight, it only served to distract her further. She wanted to be a chemist, but there were just so many things about chemistry that she did not understand, and her professor was a slave driver. There was too much work to do, and she couldn't always understand how it connected to one another. It was a great act of will for Vicky to force herself to work, but it was Friday, and she was working, so she considered it a victory, even if she was doing so in her underwear and a Hello Kitty t-shirt. The corner of her dorm room facing the door had been set up as her concentration space. She had a beanbag chair with the shine rubbed off, the filler compacted to near total rigidity. It conformed to Vicky's body perfectly. She sat, nestled in her ancient chair, knees up and her laptop resting on her thighs. After playing with the slinky a while longer, she sighed, put it aside, and went back to work on the assignment. Salvation, as an excuse, came in the form of 3 quick knocks on the door. Vicky slapped the laptop shut, put it aside, and resolved not to do anything else. It was Friday after all, and she had at least tried. Felix, in all his lean and tall glory, stood on the other side of the threshold. Vicky flung her arms around him, buried her face in his chest, and said, "Thank you." Felix shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Tiny clanking sounds chimed from the paper bag held under his arm. "What'd I do?" "You rescued me from a shitty Friday night, that's what," Vicky replied into his chest. He smelled like trombone valve grease and lavender. The smell felt safe, like home. She released him and stood on her tiptoes to give him a kiss, then took the bag and led him inside. Vicky sat cross-legged at the head of the bed and opened the bag, barely able to conceal her joy at the prospect of beer. Felix laid back with his head in her lap while they sat together on the beanbag chair. Vicky pulled 2 green bottles from the cardboard carrier and passed them both to him. He opened one with a lighter and passed it to her. She drank her beer and ran her fingers through his curly hair. "What were you working on?" Felix asked. "Chemistry," Vicky groaned. "I feel like that's all I ever do." Felix shrugged and sipped his Heineken. "It's worth it if that's what you really want to do." Vicky rested her head against the wall. "I guess," she replied. She drank her beer. She played with his hair and they drank the 6-pack together. Whenever she finished a beer, Felix reached down into the carrier, opened one with his lighter, and passed it to her. He told her jokes, and when she laughed, the sound was the small, quick song of a bird. They sat and talked for a while until Vicky reached over to Felix and patted him on the chest. "Okay, up. Time for work." Felix rolled on his seat and twisted his body to look at her. She met his gaze at first, but then her eyes drifted down without her permission to trace the highlight of his cheekbone down to his lips, along the silhouette of his chin, and across the long, sharp edge of his jaw. Vicky lingered on his collarbone and the shadow that pooled there. God, he was hot. Felix spoke, and the muscles in his neck shifted the skin there. "Can I come tonight? You think Cosmo would mind?" "He doesn't usually," Vicky replied, and gave him a mischievous grin and booped his nose with a finger. "So long as you behave." She had a hard time saying no to Felix. A spark flickered in the core of Felix's pupil. "Are you okay with it?" Vicky replied with a deepening of the smile and a raising of her chin. Her eyebrows twitched involuntarily. She bit her lip and nodded her head. Felix squeezed her knee and grinned back, then stood up and put on his shoes. Vicky slipped on her jeans and a black pair of flats, then followed Felix to his car. The two had been dating for the same number of years. They met when Vicky was in high school. Felix was 2 years older than her and already enrolled for a history degree when they met. Vicky and her best friend had heard about a college party by eavesdropping on a conversation Heather's brother, Vince, was having with his girlfriend. Vince, it seemed, was forbidden to go. He'd been caught sleeping around, and since his girlfriend was out of town and couldn't trust any of her friends to police him, since he'd fucked her best friend twice, she said it was out of the question. Vicky talked him into telling them where it was, biting her lip and leaning against the threshold to his bedroom. The act was hammy and awkward, and anyone with more brains than Dick would have been able to see through it, but fortunately for the girls, Vince had the gray matter of a stegosaurus. They left without him. "Don't even think about telling Mom and Dad," Heather warned him. "Your girlfriend texts me sometimes." It had been a memorable night. Vicky and Felix seemed drawn to each other immediately. He'd had the same car then as he was driving her in now, the antiquated Volvo station wagon, navy blue. He kept it in good condition and washed it every paycheck, especially in the winter. The steering wheel had been replaced with one that looked like a chain, and he'd taken the 7-ball from a billiard set, drilled a hole in it, and replaced the head of the gear shift with it. He was superstitious. Felix was certain that, in any set of billiards balls, there was one cursed ball. This particular 7 was the cursed ball from his father's set, and when the man had died, Felix took it and reappropriated it. He painted an eye on it, which he said would lift the curse. Vicky didn't believe any of it, but Felix's idiosyncratic beliefs were at least a third of what she loved about him. The stereo in the wagon wasn't good, and the ancient Fallen CD was scratched to hell, but Bring Me to Life was one of Vicky's favorite songs, so the disc stayed and the player was always on. Tall piles of dirty gray snow lined the street. The sky was an equally dirty color as the orange light of the street lamps diffracted off of the polluted air and into the woolly clouds. The Volvo's tires shushed through wet patches in the road, and Vicky kept her eyes on Felix the whole drive, playing a private game of peekaboo as his face was alternately illuminated by street lights and then in shadow. He loves me not. He loves me not. He loves me. Felix turned the Volvo onto the frontage road beside I-90 and then pulled into a strip club parking lot. It was a squat, plain building with a big neon sign facing the freeway. The sign was no nonsense, black and white with pink trim, which was Cosmo's joke. The words Rolling Hills stood across it in a clean Art Deco style above a pair of curves that suggested breasts. The parking lot was mostly full. It was busy for a Friday. The fuzzy boom of the music reverberated in the frigid winter air even before they got out of the car. Beneath her feet, the asphalt vibrated. The bouncer recognized them and gave Vicky a sharp, courteous nod. Outside of working hours, Bobby was a nice guy to have a beer with. He was warm and told a lot of jokes. But when he stood at the door with his arms crossed, his mouth cemented into a scowl, and his brow held in a sustained furrow, he was intimidating. He wore a gold chain and a tight black t-shirt, and he was ugly enough to be scary with his shaved head and the pale scar running a jagged zigzag from his temple to the other side of his ear. Once inside, a short man with broad shoulders came up to them with arms open wide. He had many fine wrinkles on his face that almost looked like scars, and the illusion magnified when he opened his face into the broad grin he was known for. Cosmo was a gangster, one of the remaining few who maintained a cinematic, old-school philosophy to the craft. Rolling Hills was his place, and its purpose was twofold. It was both his hobby and his lucrative money laundering facility. He loved the place, as greasy as it was, as if it were his daughter. When he got to Vicky, he put a hand on her shoulder and squeezed. "Hey, hey!" he said, loud enough to hear over the music. "How's my girl, huh? How's my girl?" "I'm good, Cosmo," said Vicky. Cosmo didn't accept fine. You had to be doing good at the least. He frowned approvingly, his head tittering like a bobblehead doll. Vicky explained, "I've got a lot of homework and not a lot of willpower." Cosmo pulled her shoulder and got her closer, then pointed a finger at her, his expression stern. "You know you gotta do it, huh, Vicky? You're gonna do great things, girl. Great things. So you dance your pretty little ass off tonight and buy yourself some willpower with the tips, huh?" The big, happy grin blew up across his face again, and all the little wrinkles pushed out residual indications of seriousness. He turned to Felix and cocked an eyebrow. "This horny fuck." Cosmo's hand slipped off of Vicky's shoulder and into his suit jacket, never once breaking his gaze from the lock it had on Felix. Felix flinched as Cosmo's hand slid back out of the suit, but the tension drained when he saw the flask. Cosmo laughed and unscrewed the flask. He took a big sip but kept his eyes trained on Felix. "Anyone ever tell you you're a jumpy little fuck?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Felix answered. "You have." "That's because it's right. I'm a wise motherfucker, Fifi, and you do pretty damn well to listen to the shit I say." They glared at each other, dogs challenging one another for dominance, until Felix lost his nerves and dropped his eyes. It was only a second, and only a centimeter, but it was enough. Cosmo won, and that pleased the broad man very much. He snickered and drank a little more, then returned the flask to his jacket. It was silver, polished to a blinding shine and monogrammed with initials that were not his. There was a story behind that flask, but Vicky never heard it. When she'd asked for it, Cosmo told her it was too long, too old, and to get back to work. The old gangster refocused his attention on Vicky, his friendliness replaced by business. Cosmo was now, unequivocally, an employer speaking to an employee. "You've got a big crowd tonight. Do a good fucking job, all right?" Vicky nodded. "Yes, sir," she said. "And you," Cosmo turned back to Felix. "You know the rules?" Felix nodded. "Buy a drink, tip Vicky, and don't buy lap dances from any other girls." "Goddamn right." Cosmo clapped a hand on the boy's bicep. Returning to Vicky, he said, this kid, he's a creep. But I like him, and you ought to stick with him. He's a pretty good boy." "I'll take that into consideration, Cosmo," Vicky replied. "Good. You got 3 sets to get changed. Go." Vicky squeezed Felix's hand and left the two men. She looked back once. Cosmo gesticulated while talking to Felix. Felix met her eyes, and Vicky gave him a small smile. Felix smiled back. The dressing room behind the stage was long and narrow, almost like a hallway, and had mirrors and bright lights lining one of the halls. Girls brought their own outfits and kept them in lockers besides the vanities. Heather sat at her vanity, touching up her natural makeup. She was very good at it, and Vicky wished she shared the talent. Vicky did her makeup big and heavy. The dark goth look was easier for her to do and fit better anyway. Heather knew how to highlight her best features. Vicky knew how to hide her worst. They'd known each other for a long time, and Heather tried to teach her, but Vicky wasn't a particularly patient student. "When are you up?" she asked Heather. She sat at the vanity next to her friend and took the makeup out of her knapsack, lining the products up at the base of the mirror. "Soon. I think I'd go before you," answered Heather after she touched up her lipstick. "What are you gonna do?" "Nasty," Heather said. It was a good choice. The cognitive dissonance was powerful, with blonde hair that went down to her shoulder blades and pink smile around straight white teeth, all stacked above plump C-cups and a waspy waistline. Heather played the part of the innocent seductress, the girl next door who knew more than she let on. She'd make those dumb boys drool. Heather finished her lip gloss and turned to Vicky. "What about you?" Vicky finished her eyes and opened her lipstick. The red was so dark it could have been black. "Dragula," she said. "That old Bob Zombie song?" Vicky twitched at the gaff. "Rob," she said. "Rob Zombie." Whatever. He's so old that he's definitely moldy. Heather finished her face, stood up, then straightened her hair and skirt. She smiled at herself in the mirror. Do I look good? Vicky gave a curt even though she hadn't looked. Heather wasn't paying attention anyway. She turned to the mirror so she could inspect her ass, bouncing the cheeks with her fingers, and apparently satisfied, she left the room. Vicky finished her face with enough time to catch the end of Heather's set. It was good. Overt, but good. Heather's style was graphic. It was a good way to warm the boys up, and judging by the primitive sounds Vicky heard over the deadpan R&B, Cosmo had organized a wise lineup. Heather finished, snatched up her clothes and money, then trotted backstage. She beamed at Vicky with a jaunty, crooked grin. Vicky complimented her haul, and Heather's smile pulled in sheepishly. Thanks. Good luck. Vicky didn't need it. Xavier, the DJ, set the scene for the boys at the club, announcing Vicky with exaggerated tones and verbal flourish. Out she stomped onto the stage. She had black leather platform boots that went up to her knees, adorned with buckles and unnecessary zippers. Underneath the black AC/DC t-shirt and the short plaid skirt, she wore black, shimmery underwear printed with skull and crossbones. Around her neck, a rubber ducky keychain dangled from the heavy ring on the thick leather collar. Vicky wasn't Vicky when she reached the pole. She was Dizzy Vicious, Rolling Hills' edgy, sharp contribution to the lineup. When she danced, she brought back memories of the mysterious girl in the back row of high school biology whose black hair, black shirt, and black parachute pants always smelled like cigarettes. She transported boys back to the days when they were just learning what a condom was used for and considered how they might get the opportunity to wear one. The frat boys loved her. She did her best to serve each one of the crisp bills as they slid across the stage, but her song was too short. When the final few riffs of Dragula were crunched, chewed, and swallowed, Vicky swept up her money, slung her clothes over her shoulder, and sashayed down the stage. She'd done well. Vicky was proud of Dizzy. She enjoyed Dizzy's ability to do things she could not, or rather, that she would not. Vicky was aware of the difference, and it was nice to let loose in that way for a few hours in the week. The next girl came up. A new one Vicky didn't know yet, but when she twerked in a big tipper's face around the middle of her song, another man reached out and squeezed her thigh. The girl jumped, scrambling away like a frightened cat. The bouncers were on him immediately. Behind the curtain partitioning the backstage, Vicky watched as the offender, huge though he was, surrendered to Bobby's grip, even raising his hands to signal defeat. Bobby's fingers dug into the man's arms, and for the benefit of the other customers, he made a show of hauling him off rougher than necessary. Vicky had seen a lot of creeps bounced, but this guy wasn't getting bounced. He was letting Bobby escort him. By the looks of his neck, shoulder, and wrists, he could have easily been the one hauling Bobby if he wanted. He must be drunk, but sober enough to recognize that he'd made a mistake. It didn't happen often, but she'd seen it before. A man's inhibitions gets lost in a greasy place like Rolling Hills, and the strong drinks didn't help keep it in check. Something about this seemed different, though. Almost like the guy was testing something. Cosmo hopped on stage with remarkable vitality for someone who looked as old as he did. He took the microphone Xavier extended for him, rolling some slack around his hand. All right. That wasn't okay. Everyone knows you don't touch the girls, am I right? Slightly enthusiastic affirmations popped from the audience like the last bits of popcorn. In case you didn't know, you don't touch the fucking girls. Even if they say you can touch them, they're lying. They do that sometimes. It's not their fault. A smattering of laughter bubbled up from the crowd, more authentic than the affirmations. Cosmo chuckled a little. Well, to help you degenerate horn dogs remember that simple fucking rule, the next round is on us. Cheers erupted from the crowd with more density and greater enthusiasm than before. When the uproar showed signs of calming, Cosmo said, tip your waitress, buy a lap dance, and most important," he pointed the mic at the crowd, receiving a loud, "Don't touch the girls." He bobbed his head. "Our next girl's a real treat, boys. You'll see. She's sexy, she's exotic, she bends like a rubber band. May I please introduce you to the shining jewel of Rolling Hills, our very own Esmeralda." The last line burned Vicky a little. Dizzy was supposed to be the jewel of Rolling Hills. Dizzy was supposed to be the best. She didn't appreciate being swept off just for the sake of getting the boys back in a better mood. After she got dressed, Vicky went directly to the bar, making sure she faced the stage so she could watch. Felix joined her immediately. "What was that all about?" he asked. "With Cosmo? Yeah, what was that bullshit?" Vicky pursed her lips, and Chris the bartender plopped a Heineken in front of her. He nodded in understanding as their eyes met. Vicky took this shit seriously. But for Felix, she shrugged it off, cocking her eyebrow and sucking down a mouthful of Dutch beer. "It's nothing," she said. "He just wanted everyone to get back to the drinks. He didn't mean anything by it." Esmeralda danced to some Bollywood shit. She wasn't even Indian. Her grandparents were from Brazil and she just happened to have dark skin. The Hindi thing was some bullshit shtick. Her real name was Molly, and she lived in a trailer. She had a problem with coke, and Vicky suspected she had HIV. Slamming the beer down her throat, Vicky rose, beckoned Felix, and led him to the dumpsters in the back. They smoked cigarettes, and though Vicky fumed, she refused to talk about it. A big, black, blocky van pulled into the back alley parking lot and idled before seeming to realize it wasn't the through road. They twisted around and crawled away. Vicky shuddered. It was cold, but the shudder crept deeper. She lit another cigarette and had Felix take her home. There, he went down on her, and they fell asleep together.
Temujin, December 6th, 2024.
Temujin was satisfied that Rolling Hills would be no match for him and his tribe. Once he'd been escorted out, he got into his van and drove home to a crumbling warehouse in a derelict part of the city. Temujin and his tribe were squatters by principle, refusing to pay for the land they lived on. They kept their land by way of force. When others tried to invade, either to steal or live there themselves, they were dealt with quickly. Temujin was very good at breaking bones and breaking spirits. Once he pulled the van into the driveway of the dilapidated warehouse, he honked the horn, and 3 men, all wearing black and each carrying a duffel bag, came out single file. The first slid the van door open. The 3 piled in. There were no seats in the back of the van. They lined up along the opposite wall, each with their knees up to their chest and their feet flat on the floor.
"The hills can be taken easily," Temujin told them.
One of the men reached across and slammed the door, then turned to Temujin. "Are we going tonight?"
Temujin shook his head. "No, we'll take it another day. It's better to get supplies first."
The other 2 men grunted and nodded. The one who spoke pursed his lips and looked at his hands. Temujin looked at him through the rearview mirror.
"You seem disappointed."
"I thought we would take them tonight," the man replied. He was the youngest of the 4 of them, and unlike the others, only had the beginning of a patchy, wispy beard sprouting along the low points of his jaw.
"Patience, brother. Soon."
Temujin still spoke to the young man through the mirror.
"You have to be patient."
The gentle reprimand didn't seem to soothe the young man's disappointment. Temujin made a note of it, deciding to handle it as soon as possible. As he drove, the 3 men in the back unzipped their duffel bags. The youngest man had brought a long, heavy sword, a motorcycle helmet elaborately painted with sharp, abstract shapes, and heavy work gloves. The rest of the bags were less anachronistic. One had 2 pistols and an assault rifle, another had a shield. They applied paints to their faces and exaggerated primal designs and fastened crude leather armor to their dense, massive bodies. Temujin pulled up to the front doors of the Fred Meyer grocery store. It was late. The parking lot was nearly empty. The men all exited the van and Temujin took the assault rifle, checked the magazine, and then pulled back the slide. The security guard within the Fred Meyer was watching with such confusion that Temujin could see the whites of his eyes even from the van. Temujin raised the rifle to his shoulder and shot a tight burst into the guard's chest. The man dropped to the floor. Blood pooled in a dark, shiny halo on the off-white floor beneath his corpse. The 4 men calmly marched into the store. The 2 men armed with pistols grabbed carts. Temujin pointed into the aisles and directed them. Then he fired into the air and screamed. He looked at the young man with the sword and pointed at a few people cowering behind the tomatoes and produce. He did not need to speak. The young man knew what he needed to do. He needed to earn his place. Extending his arms wide, holding the shield and scimitar aloft, he ripped a terrible roar from the bottom of his lungs. He charged, shield before him and sword raised above his head. The people behind the tomatoes didn't know what to do. One stepped out as if to find better cover and peeked his head over the produce. As the man with the patchy beard charged, another young man, perhaps in his early 20s, sprang from the relative safety of his cover, armed with a pair of scissors. He apparently fancied himself a hero. Temujin shot him. He crumpled. The man with the patchy beard reached the rest of them and swung his blade. The screams were scattered and short-lived. He made quick, bloody work of them. The other of Temujin's men, the ones with pistols, grabbed food in haphazard armfuls. They filled their carts with canned goods, beer, piles of meat, and little produce. They were distracted from their looting only to shoot. Temujin covered the door. No one would escape. The man with the patchy beard was tasked with slaughter and only slaughter. Tonight was his baptism. Tomorrow, having been bathed in blood, he would emerge with the day as a truly new man. The 3 with guns had undergone this trial in other states. It was a crucial ritual for shirking the shackles of civility, and it was the only path back to man's natural state of being. As Temujin listened to the screams, he judged the new brother was doing well. Blood and panic seasoned the air. Temujin was pleased, especially when his new brother brought him a conquest. A babbling, overweight man with glasses and a receding hairline stumbled forward at the edge of the man's blade. The young man forced him to his knees. Temujin understood.
"Execute him,"
he said, his voice barely audible above the gunfire in Bedlam.
"You keep what you kill."
A happy smile spread across the new one's face. The manager at his feet babbled incoherently. Tears and snot dribbled pathetically down his face. The sword went high. In a messy arc, it came to the manager's neck. The spine stopped it. So he sawed the scimitar out of the flesh, sending waves of blood down the manager's shirt, and went again, this time from the other side. The spine stopped it again.
"Take his head. Finish what you started."
So the young man with the patchy beard tossed the manager's body face first onto the floor and hacked, and hacked, and hacked. The blade stuck into the linoleum.
Good. I'm proud of you.
The young man's eyes shone. Temujin thought he might cry. Temujin's men returned with full carts. He signaled to them and they stormed out of the store, firing at cars and passersby. Temujin fired his own spray of bullets, left to right in a wide, random arc. He didn't stop until the clip was empty. The raiders tossed their haul into the van. Temujin leapt into the driver's seat and they sped away. Kopek and Bartu laughed and whooped. Kopek passed around cold beers while Bartu slapped the young man with a patchy beard on the back, splattering the saturated blood onto the walls of the van.
That was great, Bartu said.
You did great, kid. Kopek nodded. You should be proud. The young man looked at Temujin's reflection in the rearview mirror. I am, he said. Thank you. Bartu watched him with an amused expression. He took a towel from one of the duffel bags and wiped the blood from the young man's face. Temujin met his eyes in the mirror and smiled. The young man brought his beer to his lips with a shaky hand, and his face was pale as death. It would pass. It took getting used to. He'd taken the final step over the threshold of boyhood. He was now a man. Temujin had made another man. Their ranks were growing. They would one day be legion. The four men feasted that night, roasting meat over an open fire made in a pit they dug behind the warehouse. They washed the meat down with beer. Temujin would always remember that night, as he remembered every night they celebrated a new man. When the celebration was close to dying, Temujin clasped the boy's face in both hands and kissed his forehead.
You must forget your old name, he said. You are not that boy anymore. You have earned a new name. Temujin stroked the young man's cheek, a proud smile beaming from beneath his shaggy beard. When the sun rises, you will be a new man, and you will be called Sukhothai.
Sukhothai's eyes glistened, and Temujin brought his face to his chest in an embrace.
Bartu, December 6th, 2024.
While the other three reveled in the filmy haze of beer and celebration, Bartu had other plans. He'd stayed for the naming of the new man, but after the men finished the second stolen case of beer, Bartu vanished. He'd had a couple of drinks, played a round of cornhole, then watched some of another one, but the meat hadn't even finished roasting before he evaporated into the night. In truth, he could have left sooner, but despite hating the new man, Bartu kept loyalty to the traditions that he and Temujin had established all those years ago. He stayed for the institution, not for the man. Bartu wouldn't linger on it any longer. He had other plans to cleanse the sour taste the boy's new name left on his tongue. Sukhothai. He hated the name. Being second in command, Bartu was in charge of the van, accepting the duty as the natural order of things. He'd earned it. It was his right. He deserved it and the privileges that came with it. It gave him more freedom than anyone else in the decrepit death trap on Pine Street, even more than Temujin. At least, that was what Bartu told himself. While Temujin had freedom of choice, with the keys Bartu now turned in the ignition, Bartu had freedom of movement. The men were too drunk to notice the missing van, and even if one of them did, they wouldn't care. It was against their law to question those in the Ordu. In the gentle hum of the van's ambient quiet, Bartu took solace in his security and smiled. His way was lit by green light after green light, as if even the gods above had blessed his choice. But when he was caught by his first light, Bartu's thoughts turned bleak. The freedom was not real. He sat in the driver's seat of the van, but he was not in control of his life. The darkness had taken over him again. While he'd been successful at ignoring the fact that the time between dark periods narrowed, it was nearly impossible to turn a blind eye to it now. The blood seemed to have barely dried on the last woman, and now he was back in the big black Beauville, the spitting image of every homicidal lunatic and every shallow interpretation. The madness lived inside of him. The darkness fed on his blood. Blood needed blood to be repaid. He'd stalked the girl for a month and 4 days. After finishing his recruitment run at the gym, Bartu went to her home and followed her to work. It was difficult, there was no doubt about that. There was always the risk that Temujin would ask him where he'd been. But part of the excitement derived nutrition from that risk. Bartu needed that thrill. It was more than an impulse, it was a need. His soul bore the track marks of his sin. At the next light, Bartu slowed only enough to make a right turn. Her trailer was up ahead. It was so cold that the snow in the trailer park had stuck, melting only enough during the day to harden into irregularly shaped mounds of ice in the night. The Beauville stuck out as it slithered down the asphalt. It was an obvious intruder. About a third of the way down the straight road, Bartu stopped at the curb and put the van in park. He gazed at the squat, ugly white trailer, studying the little window beside the door, tracing what lines he could make out of the thin black curtains hanging like a funeral shroud. There was no movement. There wouldn't be, of course. Bartu knew her boyfriend came on Fridays, and only sometimes did he stay through breakfast on Sunday. The pimp came on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. She went out on Mondays, either for work or for pleasure. She was alone in there. Bartu shivered and smiled. The Beauville shuddered into stillness. When he stepped onto the black ice of the road, he left the keys in the ignition. This wouldn't take long. It never did. It was always too short. Even though it was early in the night, the entire trailer park seemed to be asleep. Not a front door was lit, and much like those of the future dead woman, every one of the trailers had its curtains drawn tight. The snow absorbed the sounds around the park, too. Bartu imagined that without it, he would have been under the heavy cloak of complete darkness. The street felt dead. It was easy to get into the trailer. Her neighbors were either too old, too poor, or too high to pay attention, maybe even to care about the woman, so Bartu opened the filthy, rusted gate with the palm of his hand. Despite the wear on the metal, it glided open in a smooth, silent arc. He'd greased it twice a week since following her here. Except for a small patch beside the empty Folgers can stuffed with wet cigarette butts, the snow-covered front yard was completely untouched, as fresh and crisp as it had been when it had fallen the night before. Yellow light spilled out of the window and onto the pure, white stretch. Bartu stood in the snow at the far edge of the mustard-colored square and peered through the thin space between the curtains. They framed an image of her with a tall glass bong between her legs, pulling a column of milky smoke through the chamber. Her glazed eyes searched for meaning in the images dancing on the screen. Bartu was certain she wasn't even cognizant of what she was watching on the television. He'd pieced together a narrative of her as a young woman filled with broken shards of dreams she tried to mend together with drugs, sex, and rebellion. She was just a waste of space. She wouldn't be missed. At Rolling Hill, she'd been announced as Esmeralda, but he'd heard neighbors address her as Molly. At the club, she wore electric blue eyes to draw in Johns, but she always took the contacts out when she changed clothes. The inside of the house was kept warm because she liked to be naked, and so now she sat. Lips pressed against the mouth of the bong, she cradled it close to her cunt and sparked the ashy pot and pulled again. Bartu wondered if Molly thought she'd find oblivion at the bottom of the bowl, like a decoder ring tumbling out of a box of cornflakes. What else could she possibly be looking for down there? Molly was so high that the most difficult part of Bartu's night was already done for him. She kept the volume up whenever she smoked, so Bartu imagined that he appeared in her trailer like a phantom. First, she just glanced at him, her glazed eyes sweeping over him absently. But then, she did a double take. Fear lit up her eyes like lightning. Her body spasmed with the shock. She knocked the bong onto the floor and it shattered. Foul water seeped into the low, dingy carpet. Words dribbled half-formed from her mouth, tumbling into the air. They only came out as garbled, chaotic nonsense. Bartu didn't speak. There was nothing to say. He killed her like he had the other one, quickly, mechanically, as if he simply had nothing better to do. In truth, he couldn't decide if he enjoyed it or not. He was drawn to the act, pulled into it as if by another force or by some unseen powers, but sometimes Bartu truly didn't believe he was committing the acts. It wasn't his hands gagging her with duct tape. He didn't plunge the knife into her heart or pull wide the hole the blade had made. While he saw the organs inside of her pulsing and writhing like a nest of purple leeches, it was not truly him who saw it. The distance, the overwhelming disassociation so bothered Bartu that nausea rotted his guts. He sat on the floor across from Molly as she bled out onto the couch. Didn't take long. He'd inflicted so much damage. He was amazed that she was still conscious through it all. For a second, he was even impressed. There was a sensation almost like vertigo, and then he was back inside himself. His hands were covered with red, sticky blood. His lungs filled with its scent. It was his job to dispose of the corpse that languished on the ratty couch before him. Bartu sat on the floor and wept.
Thank you for sharing my nightmares and helping me carry the grief. The psychological territory we're exploring and to make the world obey is vast and dangerous, and we're only just beginning to map its darkest corners. Next Thursday, we'll continue our descent into the minds of the subjugators and the subjugated, the masters and the slaves. If you enjoyed tonight's installment, please share your favorite nightmare with a friend or family member. Don't forget to subscribe and tell me what you think in the comments. If you'd like to go deeper, have you ever wondered what your favorite story says about you? What draws you to the stories you return to over and over again? I offer story shadow readings, literary consultations that explore the psychology behind the stories that captivate us most. Whether it's crime noir, horror, or any narrative that speaks to your shadow self, we can uncover what these stories reveal about your own psychological landscape. I also offer psychological tarot readings, creative consultations, and custom healing stories.
Visit storyshadows.com to learn more about how the darkness in fiction illuminates the complexity within us all. I'll see you next Thursday. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Good night.